in Quebec, and I'm visiting professor at Lyon at the moment. Many of you will know Professor Narbonne's groundbreaking work on Plotinus, particularly the question of evil in Plotinus, and more recently the relationship between Plotinus and Gnosticism. But he has also worked on other major issues in ancient and modern philosophy, including a monograph on Levinas, a very important work on Aristotle, on Aristotle's political philosophy, cumulative sagesse, and I think a work that struck me particularly at the time, Antiquité critique, so critical antiquity and the influence of a certain critical tradition on antiquity for the formation of modernity. And I think the paper that Professor Narbonne will be giving this afternoon fits in with this latest phase of his work, where he looks at the creative and critical potential of the antique tradition as constitutive for the shaping of the modern democratic Weltanschauung. Professor Narbonne, it's a delight to have you with us this afternoon, and we're looking forward very much to hearing your paper.
Thank you very much, Douglas. I'm very pleased to be here. I spoke in this same room a few years ago. I think it's 4 years ago, 5 years ago, something like that. And I came to see my friend Douglas and colleague a few times even before. It's always a pleasure to be here in this lovely city and university. And I hope we'll have a very good exchange at the end of my paper, with the title of it being Religion, Rhetoric and Politics in Sophocles Antigone, Some Reflections. As a philosopher, not a literary critic, I would like to develop some ideas upon this fully deep philosophical tragedy by Sophocles, a play which, as you know, might be considered the most important one in the world's history of theater, the one, at least, which has received most attention in literary history, according to George Steiner and others. A play, not surprisingly, which has received historically a countless number of interpretations, many sometimes very opposed to each other. A play, accordingly, upon which a lot of things has been said and which has been analyzed in every sense, and therefore could be considered quite well known. Is it the case? Well, in a way, yes. This play is very much known, but there is a little detail I would like to draw attention to. The fact that we know close to nothing of the circumstances surrounding the first presentations of the play in Athens at 441, 448 BC, and about the probable several rehearsals of it in the close time afterwards. I'm not talking about the fact that this tragedy was presented at the Dionysian, a festival we are fairly well acquainted with, but that we know almost nothing of the impression it left to the Athenian public at that time. What did they think of it? What content or message did they discover in this play at all? On this dimension of the play, we are almost in the dark. Concerning the text itself, we learn that the first official transcript of the tragedian plays in general was commissioned much later by Lycurgus in 334, 325 BC. So this is a first significant gap, a century, in the history of the transmissions of the text. Apparently, the first mention of any reading of a single play at that time is in Aristophanes, The Frogs, 405 BC, line 52-54, a very short passage anyway about Euripides' Andromeda. Long after that, Aristophanes of Byzantium, 257 BC, is supposed to have edited the whole of Greek tragedy. And we have from him one of the hypotheses, prose summaries about Antigones. And so we can sadly see, as it has been expressed by commentators, I give an example, I quote, that evidence for the work of individual scholars on Sophocles' text is thin, end quotation. It is thin, and it is also very late. As we all know, the dates of the philosopher Aristotle himself are 384, 322. So his time is even before the first fixations of the text by Lycurgus I just mentioned. But more importantly, Aristotle is possibly the first one ever to tell us anything about the eventual meaning of this piece of art. The very first one may be, if indeed, the Oratio de Falsa Legatione of Demosthenes is later in time. We do not know if it is the case or not. The dates of Demosthenes, I must recall, are exactly the same as the one for Aristotle. And we have no way to date precisely the text of Aristotle's Rhetoric itself. So we don't know which one is first. Before turning to Aristotle, let's consider just one moment what Demosthenes has to say about this play and what we can make of it. In his Oratio de Falsa Legatione, he is criticizing Aeschines, and he says, Aeschines attempts to insult others by labeling them act writers and sophists. He shall himself be proved liable to these very imputations. The verses he quoted are derived from the Phoenix of Euripides, a play which has never to this day been acted either by Theodorus or Aristodemus, the actors under whom Aeschines always played third-rate parts, though it was performed by Molo and no doubt by other actors of former times. But the Antigone of Sophocles has often been acted by Theodorus and often by Aristodemus, and in this play, there are some admirable and instructive verses which Aeschines must know quite well by heart, since he has often delivered them himself, but which he has omitted to quote. For you know, I'm sure, that in every tragedy it is, as it were, the special privilege of third-rate actors to play in the role of tyrants and scattered kings. Consider then these excellent lines placed by the poet Sophocles in the mouth of our Creon Aeschines. In this play, lines which he neither Aeschines repeated to himself to guide him as an ambassador, nor yet quoted to the jury. And then there's these quotations of Antigone. Creon is speaking. To learn aright the soul and art and mind of any man, for that device is none, till he prove in government and law, and so reveal. For he who guides the state, yet cleaves not in his counsels to the best, but from some fear in prison locks his tongue, is in mine eyes as he had ever been vilest of man. And him who sets his friends before his land, I count of no esteem. For I, be it known to God's all-viewing eye, would never keep silence, seeing the march of doom upon this city, nor ever take to me as mine own friend my country's foe. For this I know that she, our country, is the ship that bears us safe, and safe abroad her while she sails erect, we make good friends. End quotations. Since Demosthenes goes on, none of these lines did Aeschylus ever repeat to himself during his mission. Instead of preferring his country, he thought that to be friend and guest friend of Philip of Macedon, what was much more important and profitable for himself, and bade a long farewell to the wise Sophocles. End quotations. What is interesting for us in this excerpt? First, we see that it was usual in Athens and probably in other cities as well to perform this play and to enroll for that different actor, not necessarily professionals. Second, that Demosthenes considers the principle of government put forward in this passage by Creon inspiring and worth following. But apart from that, all in all, we do not learn much about the appreciations of the play itself, its global meaning for the public at that time, etc. The account is really partial, even fragmentary. Would we be a bit luckier with Aristotle? Not impossible, I must say. But first, a preliminary remark. I'm not sure it has been taken seriously into account, but the first interpretation known to us ever proposed of this play, at least of the part of this play, is the one advanced by a philosopher around 100 years after its first presentations to the public. And so this is, again, a serious gap. Was Aristotle well placed to capture the main intentions of the poet, writing this play in his own political and cultural context? This is far from certain. Was his intention to offer a comprehensive interpretation of the play in itself? This is also highly doubtful, but at least he offers Aristotle's a partial interpretation of it. As you know, in the Rhetoric, Aristotle's Rhetoric, Aristotle quotes 2 times with seeming approval and even with admiration, I would say, the famous passage where Antigone, the girl, states out loud she will never comply to Creon's demand, specifically to let her brother Polynices die like that, deprived of any ritual, the prey of wild beasts and birds. Antigone's famous declarations runs as follows. You all know it at verse 450. Yes, since it was not Zeus that published me that edict, the edict is a kerugma in Greek, and since not of that kind are the laws with which justice who dwells with the gods below established among men. Nor did I think that your decrees, you, Creon, were of such a force that a mortal could override the unwritten and unfailing ordinance of the gods. For their life is not of today or yesterday, but forever, and no one knows when they appear. Not for fear of any man's pride was I about to owe a penalty to the gods for breaking these. End quotations. Here we notice 2 kinds of laws or measures mentioned by Sophocles: the ancestral, unwritten, and divine nomina, laws, rules, customs. It's difficult to choose how to translate. And supposedly the laws of Creon, the laws of the city. Aristotle sees here a battle between the unwritten laws and the civic laws. And in the rhetorical analysis he is conducting, he holds mainly that Creon is a pure legalist without art, and that it is better to stay open to the unwritten laws than to stick to the letter of the positive laws. I quote Aristotle. Now, there are two kinds of laws, particular and general. By particulars law, I mean those established by each people, each country, in reference to themselves, which again are divided into written and unwritten. By general laws, I mean those based upon nature. In fact, there is a general idea of just and unjust in accordance with nature, as all men in a manner divine, menteontai, even if there is neither communication nor agreement between them. This is what Antigone in Sophocles evidently means when she declares that it is just, though forbidden, to bury Polyneices as being naturally just. And he quotes Antigone, Aristotle, for neither today nor yesterday, but from all eternity, these statutes live and no man knoweth, hence they came. End quotation. We can observe in Aristotle's descriptions of Antigone's declarations a departure from Sophocles' own standpoint and language. First, he naturalized the so-called unwritten, divine, and ancestral laws. He speaks instead of laws, I quote, based upon nature, which we divinize or surmise or presage, not of divine laws as such. Second, he doesn't mention either that Creon himself, several times in the play, also pretends to speak in the name of the gods, but the civic gods this time as opposed to the Ctonian gods. We stand here in front of a quarrel between two types of gods, not simply between a believer and an atheist, as Hegel already saw it, but as many subsequent classical commentators try to deny or minimize it. In any case, Aristotle's comments few pages later, the same passage again, in the context of a fictional trial, where he says one could use the following argument to defend himself. I quote, "For it is evident that if the written laws is counter to our case, our fictional case, we must have recourse to the general law and equity as more in accordance with justice. And we must argue that when the dicast takes an oath to decide to the best of his judgments, he means that he will not abide rigorously by the written laws, that equity is ever constant and never changes, even as the general law, which is based on nature, whereas the written laws often vary. This is why Antigone in Sophocles justifies herself for having buried Polyneices contrary to the law of Creon, but not contrary to the unwritten law. For this law is not of now or yesterday, but is eternal. This I was not likely to infringe, though fear of the pride of any man." End quotations. Here again, the unwritten laws are not the divine laws, but what is common, o koinos, and that which is more equitable and just, to koino Christian kaitois, epikesterotois, kai dikaiostherois, The explanations being that, I quote, because the suitable always stays and never changes, neither what is common, because it is according to nature, says Aristotle. So Antigone's attitude is in accordance with the natural law and is more just by being more equitable and suitable. And so Créon acts in full legality, but not in an equitable way. Is this really the sense of Antigone's behavior in Sophocles' play? Is it not instead that the divine laws she relies on are, in her belief, not only equitable, but clearly stronger than what Créon has imposed? To be equitable is for Aristotle to consider the context and to determine that even though the law may seem just, it is not always automatically so, because it is not automatically equitable. The judge, he states, is like an assayer of silver, whose duty is to distinguish spurious from genuine justice, that it is the part of a better man to make use of and abide by the unwritten rather than the written law. Of course, Créon could have done so, and things would have softened radically. But this would mean to ask the leader to raise his own law to the level of some new equity, to reconsider the law in a way. Is this what Antigone is asking for? A new version of Créon's commandment? What she says is that Créon's edict has no strength whatsoever in front of the unwritten and unfailing ordinance of the gods. The rule she is following are the strongest, and she expects absolutely nothing from the tyrant. More precisely, it is not because her laws are simply stronger than Créon's laws, but that Créon's proclamations is not even for her a real law, but just a kerugma, the proclamations, the edict of a strategos, the ultra vires edict, in fact, of a general in power, which directive she doesn't acknowledge and which the people of the city feel anyway unfair. Antigone is against not the city laws as such, but the misrepresentations of a particular edict. As far as we can see, Aristotle had no suspicions at all of these dimensions of the play, and is not at any rate, and he is not at any rate trying to make sense of the play himself. For him, the oppositions under examinations in his rhetorical essay is between two fair and legitimate types of laws, natural and conventional, and he sees in Antigone a good way to illustrate it. The possibility that Sophocles was trying to exemplify the character of a tyrant and the consequences of his political misconduct and excess had no place whatsoever in his mind. In a way, we could say that Hegel himself follows globally Aristotle's lines of analysis, taking the unwritten divine laws Antigone had confidence in, and the civic laws also of divine character defended by Créon, as two rightful but irreconcilable positions, two standpoints of equal and conflicting forces one must surpass to render civic life at all possible. And to be honest, it is not so much risky to suggest that Hegel did indeed borrow this old scheme of analysis as reading directly Aristotle's Rhetoric. But what if this amounts to a misunderstanding of Sophocles' intentions in the drama, not to entertain two contradictory equipotent options, but to underline the terrible consequences of an abuse of power, Créon's promulgation being possibly ultra vires, the act of a tyrant extending in peacetime the prerogative of wartime and war conditions. We learn already at line 15 of the play, right at the beginning of the plot, that the Argive army has left, that the war is in fact over, and already at line 8 about the proclamations of the general, the strategos, Créon, to whom Antigone never credits the name of kings, by the way. In all the piece, at no one time, Antigone says, you are a king. It's always the tyrant. The tragic of this tragedy, therefore, would not be the result of two irreconcilable issues, but the inevitable outcome of any tyrannical abuse of power, showing to the Athenian public with Créon a counter-image of what a real office bearer should do, and representing Thebes' government practice as the exact opposite of the Athenians' one. Wouldn't any average Athenian spectator in 441 have immediately understood the subtext of Sophocles' caricatural depictions of the Theban's leader, and still more, the dignitaries of the democratic regime sitting in the first row of the public? Let's take a very simple example of this. Aimon, who is both the son of Créon and Antigone's fiancé, Aimon tries to convince his father to change his mind regarding the condemnations of his beloved one. Here's the text, line 726, Créon, men of my age, are we then to be schooled in wisdom by men of his Aimon? Aimon, not in anything that is not right, but if I'm young, you should look to my conduct, not to my years. Créon, is it worthy conduct to honor disruptors? Aimon, I could not use anyone to show respect for the wicked. Créon, and is she not, Antigone, in the grasp of that disease? Aimon, it is not what says the people from the same city, Thebes. So people of Thebes are more on the side of Antigone than on his side, Créon. Créon, shall Thebes prescribe to me how I must rule? Aimon, see there how you have spoken so much like a child. Créon, must I rule this land for another and not for myself? Aimon, that is no city which belongs to one man. Créon, answer, does not the city by traditions belong to the man in power? Aimon answers, you would make a fine monarch, but in a desert. This exchange is, of course, a plain parody of the oppositions between a tyrannic and a democratic city. And everybody knew from Aeschylus' Persian's play, the famous line about the Athenians, line 242, they are no slaves, they obey no man. To imagine 1 second that the citizens of Athens did not grasp such an allusion is simply to obliterate the cultural and political context of this piece. It is obvious that Aristotle had no interest in these matters when he referred to the unwritten laws, but had another goal in mind. And the same could be said of centuries of readers of the play afterwards, since no direct interpretative impulse from the public in plays was available to us. I would like to take another piece of evidence from the drama, still relating to the exchange between Aimon and his father. Just before the abstract we just looked at, Aymon exposes the merits of common deliberations and reasoning in such affairs, saying, I quote Aymon, line 684, Father, the gods implant reason in man, the highest of all things that we call our own. For my part, to state, oh, you are wrong, to say those things is beyond my power and my desire, although another man too might have a useful thought. In any case, it is my natural duty to watch on your behalf all that men say or do or find to blame. For dread of your glance forbids the ordinary citizen to speak such words as would offend your ear. But I can hear these murmurs in the dark. All the city moans for this girl, saying, no woman ever merited death less. None ever did so shamefully for deeds so glorious as hers, who, when her own brother had fallen in bloody battle, would not leave him unburied to be devoured by savage dogs or by any bird. Does she not deserve to receive golden honor? Such is the rumor shrouded in darkness that silently spreads. For me, Father, no treasure is more precious than your prosperity. What indeed is a nobler ornament for children than the fair fame of a thriving father, or for a father than that of his children? Do not then bear one mood only in yourself. Do not think that your word and no other must be right. For if any man thinks that he alone is wise, that in speech or in mind he has no peer, such a soul, when laid open, is always found empty. End quotations. What is here to add? The oppositions between solitary reasoning and common deliberative one being so clear, and the condemnations for emptiness so definitive. As the German historian Christian Mayer noted, I quote, the poet Sophocles must have been nourished with democracy, and he must have suffered interiorly the test of its difficulties to be able to formulate the idea that the individual who believes in the unicity of opinion is an empty being. As another commentator had put it, Griffith, that we saw last night, the audience may have seen in the play, I quote, confirmations that their own democratic system can prevent such egregious misbehavior among the elite. But let's come back for a moment to the questions of Antigone's religious belief. What the poet makes her declare is impressive. She feels a real obligations toward the deceased, and she believes that the divine laws concerning the care of the dead are both unchangeable and unbreakable. They are, she says, the unwritten and unfailing ordinance of the gods. One can say that for her, the dead command, in a sense, the living one. And for an obvious reason, she says herself, for the time is greater that I must please those below than those here, since in that world I will rest forever. End quotation. So it is both in her mind a compulsory responsibility and a delighted one. And then there is this extraordinary sentence about those unwritten laws or rules. For their life is not of today or yesterday, but forever, and no one knows when they appear. Kai udes oiden ex otu fane. One has irremediably in mind Kant's famous statement in his Critique of Critical Reason about the moral law within me, saying, as you know, two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admirations and reverence, the more often and more steadily one reflects on them, the starry events above me and the moral law within me. As the poet says, we do not know when they manifest themselves and impose themselves, but they live, not only exist, but live within and with us. There is no way and no interest either to escape them. And so Antigone herself rests on absolute solid ground. Both against Créon's proclamations and any police legislations if necessary. The play showing clearly that such a clash is precisely not necessary, but here arbitrarily introduced by the despot stance. In ancient Greece, the refusal of burial was considered, as you know, an extreme offense, and therefore the condemnations pronounced by Créon could not but appear exorbitant. Few lines before Antigone's declarations, line 450, and in a way preparing the soil for it, we come across the first stasimon of the play, a high philosophical piece questioning the metaphysical status of human beings. And there already the moral conditions of man's life is scrutinized. There is on one side the Promethean dimensions where the poet underlines the self-creating activity of the human race. He says, I quote line 355, speech and thought fast as the wind, and the impulses that give order to a city, he has taught himself, man has taught himself how to live. But immediately after comes the warning that man must take care, brilliant as he is, not to fall into wickedness. I quote, possessing resourceful skill, a subtlety beyond expectations, he moves the man now to evil, now to the good. When he honors the laws of the land and the justice the gods have sworn to uphold, he is high in the city. But banned from his city is he who, thanks to his impudence, couples with disgrace. End quotation. So both attitudes are for human being at hand, just because he is Deinos, that is simultaneously marvelous and terrible, formidable and worrying, accepting himself from the basic natural order. As Sophocles wrote at the beginning of the Stasimon, Polata Deina kai uden anthropou dei noteron pelei. There are many things terrible, nothing more terrible than man. It is, of course, tempting to see Créon as the one who do not honors the law of the land and the justice the gods have sworn to uphold, even though he claims rightfully to speak also on behalf of some divinities, which gives him, although no right, to ignore the legitimate request of the heroine, as some compromise would have been possible, like offering the burial to take place outside the city limits of Thebes. Be that as it may, a very different lecture than the one usually proposed can be conducted regarding this tragedy. We consider particularly tragic the confrontations between Antigone and Créon and what followed from it. And tragic it is, undoubtedly. But over and above those fatal consequences, the Athenians may have found also highly tragic what initiated such an outcome. That is, a political attitude absolutely alien to what they were adopting themselves, a counter image really of the governance they both cherished and promoted. Créon is typically achieved as they don't like it, governing without consulting, considering the city as his own property. Some of his claims are clearly defendable. We saw it in Demosthenes' analysis. But the way he enforces them without any other considerations proved at the end disastrous. For Aristotle, Créon acts indeed legally, but without fairness. We saw that. For Antigone, the case is more complicated. Créon acts tyrannically because he extends in peacetime the power of his strategos in wartime. But even if Créon was rightfully and without any contestations the king, which is clearly not the case, because we have indications in the play that his role as a king is doubtful. We don't know how he came in power. Is he legitimate? For Antigone, he is never legitimate. His so-called promulgation, kerugma, would remain for her questionable because it does not take into account other significant customs or habits. The city privilege is one thing, but his city is also, as Aristotle formulated it, a partnership of families and of clans in living well. So one must necessarily take into consideration the desiderata of those families and clans. So Créon's visions is for her both one-sided and extreme. For Sophocles himself, Créon, resting at least partly on defensible principles, as a way of unilaterally imposing them, which results in a catastrophe for everyone, including himself. His numeral refusal of compromise, his incapacity to hear out the arguments of others, all his attitude is a counterexample of what a good leader should act. B. Sophocles didn't have to declare it out loud that Créon was anti-democracy, that good deliberation might have supplied a reasonable solution to the tragedy. Everybody in the assistance spontaneously understood it. And it is only our remoteness from the historical context of the play, our disinterest into also in the matter itself, that can explain the absence of this concern in our interpretations of the play. So I would conclude that the two things are in no way antithetical in this work. Sophocles, the pious man that we know for long, Sophocles, the Democrat that we surprisingly forgot. Thank you.
Very much. Questions?
Yeah. Does Sophocles award like democracy as a method of like producing nomos or conventional law? Does he award it a kind of special connection to like physis or divine nature? And then if he does, then how does he reconcile when there's kind of a mismatch between democracy, the laws produced from democracy, and then the kind of divine laws?
We don't know. We don't know. We know quite a bit of things about Sophocles' life. I just read recently the book from Jacques Joanna Sophocle. It's a presentation of the man and his work. It's very complete. It's a large work. And we have some details about his life and his convictions and so on and so forth. He was very close to Pericles, a sort of friend with Pericles, also quite possibly with Herodotus. So he knew very well the sophistic milieu and all the conflicts about democracy. We know that. He was also heteroname at one point, so he was administrating the public treasury. Okay, so he was very much implicated in the city, democratic system. Also, when Antigone was presented, it's very curious because we don't know if he got the first rank, the first prize for this play. We only know, we don't know that he did not. We know for other plays by him who won the first prize. For this one, I didn't see, nowhere I saw this clearly mentioned, but the people were so pleased by it, they say that because of it, he was named Strategos. And he went as a strategos, he went with Pericles to the island of Samos, to stop the revolt of Samos. Okay. Was he valid as a strategos? I have doubt. There's a sentence from Pericles saying that, what are you doing here? About strategy. It was an honorific, nomination. But as for the very detailed questions you ask, it's difficult to answer. The way I see it is that he senses the tensions in the city, what people may think on one side and other side, and he puts it, up front, and and because the what is very fascinating with this play is that sometimes you can take the side of Créon, sometimes you can take the side of Antigone. So it's almost like it's not perfectly parallel, but because at the end I think Créon is kaput gemacht, really, and he's very clearly by Sophocles declared the one responsible for everything that happened, so it's difficult for me to answer more in detail. I think he was a Democrat. I think he was close to the regime. He participated in it. And there's only one thing. At the end of his career, he was at one point close to the people who made la tyrannie des 30, the 30 tyrants, okay, for a short period, because maybe he thought that there was no way out at that time. We don't know exactly. Some people say that the Sophocles in question, it's not the same Sophocles. So we don't, there's a, sorry if I cannot, answer you more precisely.
We have a question from, sorry, there is a question from Valerie. Valerie, can you unmute yourself, please?
Yes, can you hear me? I've been getting slightly interrupted reception. I'd like to thank Professor Narbonne for this wonderful reminder of the crucial themes in the play, and really just to ask whether you feel the time is right now for a revival of interest in this play, given what we're seeing in terms of democracy under threat and the disastrous effects of tyranny.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because it's very interesting to see that since what is happening now in Ukraine and all that, we see people, many people are realizing how important it is that we live in our system, political systems. And there's a real movement, I find, in this direction. Because before that, many people were saying, well, anyway, democracy, it's all false, and it's all it's all populism, and so on and so forth, which is true in a way. But I think there's a new conscience because of that. And of course, it's difficult not to trace the parallel between Créon and Putin, because he imposes his visions without considerations. It's very fascinating to see, as an example, how President Biden, it's very complicated for him to take a decision. He must take into account many, advices and people and all that. It's a difficult process. The other one, he lives by himself, so it seems. So yes, my answer would be yes. If we read Antigone in this slide, and by the way, I want to insist on the fact that when I'm underlining this sense of the play, I'm not saying that it doesn't have other senses, other significations. Of course it has, because the play presents itself with many contradictory principles, and is showing, the opposition between the male and the female. We have that in the play, between the young and the old, between the divine and the civic, and between the dead and the living. All that is present. So what I'm saying is not to say everything we saw in this tragedy doesn't exist, and all that exists is this democratic political dimension. It's not the way it is.
No.
But what I find surprising is that almost nobody noticed that. I'm trying to, if you look at the history of the interpretations of Antigone from Middle Age to now, it's only, I would say, since 1950, 60, 70 maybe, that slowly what I'm talking about was perceived. Nobody's talking about that before that. I found one exception, Auguste Beck in 1850 something. And when he saw that what Emon was declaring are democratic principles, he saw it, but he didn't follow the path, but he saw it. But apart from him, it's only, I would say, like since the 1980s years that slowly, evidence came back that it's an important topic in the play. So I don't know if I'm answering.
I do think so.
We have another question in fact.
Thank you. You've just partly answered my question. That was about when this play was being interpreted.
Yeah.
One of the high points of that sort of interpretation.
Yeah.
And it seems to me what you're saying is in the 20th century.
Yeah.
That democratic interpretation comes about from the 20th century onward. And I wonder if before that it was this interpretation of tyranny or fascism versus freedom of conscience.
Yeah.
Because that's been another interpretation.
Yeah. Well, for a long time, Antigone was considered Christian martyr, and she was divinized for that. Okay, so that was totally other, type of interpretation. She has been also interpreted as the beginning of individual freedom. The possibility of resisting others and all that, which is in a way a falsity, because she's Antigone. She doesn't act freely. She acts according to some principle she feels she must follow. So there's a principle of resistance to the civic order, yes, but not because she wants to be free or she decides by herself what she wants to do, but because she follows other traditions. See, so it's not because in Hegel, Hegel interprets the play as being like the first invention of human subjectivity, more or less, which is not totally false, but which is partially false, because she's not a figure of unicity or uniqueness, or no, she follows the rule of the family. She wants to defend the family, in this tradition. So it took quite a bit of time to talk about this, to see these dimensions. And what is very fascinating is to discover again that you find what you look for. If you don't look for that, if you don't have the impulse to look for that, you don't see it. And for centuries, we didn't see it. And now that put forward the arguments, you say, how come you didn't see it? It's so clear,
Please do.
Did Leo Strauss write anything on Antigone?
Leo Strauss?
Yeah.
I didn't read, if it's the case, I didn't read it.
Okay.
No,
Oh,
it's, what's this? I can't remember her name. Celle qui a écrit The Woman, the American Woman, German name. She, The Fragility of Goodness.
Oh, Nussbaum.
Yeah, Martha Nussbaum. Martha Nussbaum, she saw it in a way because she's one, she took notice of the fact that there are so much vocabulary around bully, like the bully system, how to choose the counsel and all that. And Créon is always criticized by Sophocles because for his dysboulia, his bad decision. So the vocabulary of the democratic system of decisions is always there as you see in no other tragedy. So it's a sign that we're not inventing something. It's really there, And at the end, he says, Créon himself, oh, bad decisions, I took it. It's all around that. So, but again, it took quite a bit of time to pinpoint that.
We have a question from Isidoros. Isidoros, if you are still here, can you unmute yourself?
Yes.
Hello, there is an issue with my camera, so I'm sorry about this. Yes, thanks, Amir, for the amazing talk. I was with you until the last comment about the beginning of freedom and so on, but I won't ask about that because I think that indeed we can trace the debates about freedom and oppression and just law in Antigone. But my question originally was, why do you think that Aristotle missed the point?
I think Aristotle was very much impressed by the play, and he seems very admirative about it. And for Aristotle in political field, the question is what is right, what is wrong, but also what is right and wrong at what time, in what conditions, and so on and so forth, is very central to his analysis. And he saw in Antigone one circumstance of that, where to some extent you can say that Créon has good argument. You must defend the city, which is, this is normal. But on the other side, what Antigone is asking for is also legitimate. And for Aristotle, as I said, Créon c'est un salaud légaliste. A legalist, bad.
Dirty legalist.
What?
Dirty legalist.
Yeah. Un salaud légaliste, who sticks to the,
A rigorist.
Yeah, yeah, one-sided. And so he saw in it a good example of what he was trying to explain, you know, in political field and also in juristic field, how you can, you know, find a way between what is written and what is 2 days ago here, I got a new idea about a proof that what I'm saying is really defensible. Okay, when you compare the piece from Aeschylus, les 7 contre terre, the 7 against, yeah, it's the same story, okay, about, you know, Polynices and Eteocle who fights against Thebes and all that. And at the end of the play, you know what he says? He says, first, it's not Créon who condemned Polynices of no burial. It's the Senate. It's the probula. It's the regime itself. First distinction. And second, it's plainly the decision is plainly troublesome. And you know what the cœur, what the cœur says? He says, well, Créon has good argument, and Antigone also has good argument. So we must split ourselves, and one part of the core will go with Créon's civic law, and one part of the core will follow Antigone. It's a funny decision, and so it shows that for Aeschylus already this questions was problematic. Was it a good thing to condemn Polynices or not? As opposed to what Sophocles says, make Créon say that it's out of the question, he has to be let unburied. See what I? So it's a decision from Sophocles. He decided to show the circumstance that way, just to show how it is that you have no solutions when the tyrant is the only one deciding. And at the end of the 7 against Thebes, the reason brought forward to explain why it ends up like that, it says, because in the cities, the just and the unjust vary. So the same principle that, you know, Sophocles wants to show that Créon should have been more open because it's a very delicate question, and he was not. So it's very interesting to see the difference of treatment of the same mythological situation between Aeschylus and Sophocles. So from Sophocles, the way he presented Créon, it is volontaire.
Is it possible to, if there is a second round, I would like to ask the same question from a different perspective. Should I go now? So Jean-Marc, you said, you made a distinction between the tyrant and the king, and you said that as Sophocles reads the situation, Créon is clearly a tyrant, which makes his decision an ultra vires decision. So it's law deprived of the authority to be promulgated. So it's valid law, is invalid law.
Yeah.
Whereas if he were a king, it would have been unjust law, which is the approach that Aristotle is taking, namely when he says that no, it's against the unwritten law and the law of equity. It means that it is law, but it is unjust law, it is unfair law.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you agree with that, do you think that given the situation in Aristotle's time, namely the king in Macedonia, and his ruling, and Aristotle being in his service or being related to the court and to that kind of regime. Do you think that he's probably addressing the situation from the perspective of the new political circumstances in Greece at his time?
Yeah, possibly. I would say possibly. I mean, it's very difficult to say that, but I think that the real meaning of Antigone's play, Aristotle in a way is blind to it. He's not interested into these questions. So he doesn't ask himself, is Creon the tyrant really legitimate in his procedure? As he doesn't question that at all. For him, and as a matter of fact, he calls the kerugma a law of Creon. In Sophocles, it's not a law, it's a proclamation. Okay? So in Greece, in Athens, you have two sorts of proclamation. You can have proclamations that was put to vote beforehand. That's one thing. It's not the case in this piece. All of a sudden, Creon, newly in command, he promulgates this condemnation, these interdictions, and this is it. And there is a play here between Antigone and him, and she says, well, your kerugma doesn't have any force, or it's not legal, or it's not, okay? But the rest of it stays into darkness. Where does it come from? I was asking myself the other day, why does Antigone think that Creon is illegitimate? And I have a possible answer. It's because he's not a Labdacian. Ce n'est pas un Labdacide. Okay? He's a cousin. They have partly some common ancestors, but Creon doesn't come from the Labdacide line. No, for him, which is the royal line, for him, he's a bastard. So right from the beginning, it's true he's the only male left. Okay, all the other Polynesians, they killed one another. So there's no more in the field. Okay, so he's the only male, but he's a male, and it's also interesting to see Creon. What is his role in Oedipus Tyrannus? What is his role in Oedipus Apollon? That's the same, because he's always coming from outside, Creon, when he has the occasion, he takes the power, see what I mean? It's very strange. In Antigone, how did he become? And there's another factor that is fundamental. Right at the beginning of the play, a lot of you remember Tista. Creon, he promulgates something else. He summons a Senate rendezvous, a Senate reunion in private. It's written in the text, dica, separated from the public, with the senator, the senator is like the, anyway. And he asked them to be loyal to him. He says, you've been loyal to Laios, you've been loyal to Oedipus, you've been loyal to, I ask you to be loyal to me and to follow. Why is he doing that? If he's the natural and without any objections possible king, why does he ask for that? Why does he think, and it's many places in the play where he says, all the ones that are against me, they are violent, they take into account money, they are there for the money. Even Tiresias, he says, you're there for the money. So he's a paranoid, he's a paranoiac person, and he thinks everyone is against him. So somewhere there's a question of legitimacy. He doesn't feel he's legitimate. And why is that? But this is all in darkness. It's, you know, it's behind the scene in purpose, with purpose by Sophocles in the play. You know, how did he become a king? Why? And all that. For Antigone, he's not.
I have a question here. Oh, and
Just
well, I'm
one-
throwing this. This is a very quick thought. And
Okay, right. Let's go.
So, is the difference between Sophocles and Aristotle a difference in their vision of the human being? And you mentioned the great line about humanity being denos, you know, that there's something remarkable, but of course terrifying and about human being, which is not a distinctively Aristotelian view of the human being.
It depends. It
So what?
depends.
Well, I wonder if you could
Yeah,
comment
yeah.
whether you think.
In Aristotle's Politics, you know, he says that every man in power, if you leave him, let him command, will become a monster. You know, every man is in want of power. If he gets it and there are no counterbalance, he will become. There's this sentence where he says, I know it in French, le pouvoir corrompt les magistrats, même les meilleurs, even the best one.
So it corrupts even the best.
Even the best one, even the best one. So on the, I find, generally speaking, that Aristotle is very close to Sophocles.
Okay.
And if I can make a bow on this occasion about something, I would say that my first intuition of these dimensions of the play comes from Pierre Aubanc in his book, La Prudence chez Aristote. Because at the end of this book, there's these reflections where he says the phronesis, both the phronimos, both in home affair, in personal affair, and in public affair. Okay, the phronimos in Aristotle, says Aubanc, goes back hand to hand with the tragedian way of representing life.
Ah.
Okay, and then I saw that, I read that, and I said that's, and he quotes Antigones with this dus boulia and boulia questions, and then I thought myself, well, this is interesting, you know, and because of that, I think that the way Sophocles reflects on politics is very, I would say, compatible to what Aristotle's maintained. That's
Thank you.
yeah.
Clearly.
Also about the comparison between Aristotle and Sophocles, since you told that Aristotle kind of misinterprets Sophocles, not misinterprets, but is not really interesting in some of the aspects of the complexity of Sophocles' tragedy. I was wondering, isn't the fact that it's not about Aristotle, but isn't maybe the fact that to show some kind of complexity and to render some type of complexity, literature is the only genre possible to show that, and not philosophy. So it's not just that Aristotle was not interested, it's that maybe some kind of things are better rendered in literature and not in philosophy.
That's what, in a way, Aristotle thinks.
Okay.
He says that because Aristotle has great admirations for Aeschylus, Sophocles, and the poets.
Mm-hmm.
And he thinks that the complexity of life is better represented in fictions and, you know, than in
Treaties.
What?
Treaties.
In treaties and in arithmetical,
Mm-hmm.
so to call, you know, ratios and okay, because the circumstances are so all the time different and moving, you know. So in this view, he says, Aristotle, that you must take into account the phronesis, not the Platonic one, but the one from the tragic before Plato. Okay, that's what he says. So that's one point. Apart from that, it's just that, you know, he's writing his rhetorical treatise and he thinks it's a good argument that he can put forward, you know, to exemplify, illustrate, you know. Of course, he knows Antigone, but what does he think of it generally? What does he think of it at the end? You know, we don't know.
We don't know. Okay.
He doesn't talk about it, you know. What's funny is that he doesn't have these intuitions that maybe this promulgation is not legal, even legal. He doesn't ask these questions. For him, it's a law.
Okay.
So I guess maybe as someone, maybe because he is in another political context, he doesn't sense that this, but I'm sure that that's my conviction. People in the theater in Athens, it's impossible they didn't see what I've done. For me, I think it's impossible.
Yeah.
I think it's, you know, there's sometimes we say, I'm the one who commands, and that's the way it should do. I mean, for him, it's a comedy.
Yeah.
Any further questions? Well, I think if not, then I think it's the right moment to thank Professor Narbonne for an extremely rich, insightful, and stimulating paper this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed.